Đây là chương trình sinh hoạt cộng đồng phát thanh trực tiếp trên làn sóng của đài 2VNA. Chúng tôi là Nguyễn Văn Thân và cũng xin thay mặt cho ông Hoàng Nam thân ái kính chào quý thính giả trên toàn quốc và quý khán giả khắp nơi trên trang mạng YouTube 2VNA Radio Interview. Và đây cũng là một cái chương trình rất là đặc biệt, là tại vì như tất cả chúng ta cũng đều biết, vào ngày thứ Bảy này là sẽ có cuộc bầu cử Quốc hội liên bang diễn ra vào ngày thứ Bảy 7 tháng 9. Và cũng trong cái dịp bầu cử này thì chúng tôi có một cái chương trình đặc biệt, là chúng tôi được hân hạnh đón tiếp ông Jason Clare, Bộ trưởng Bộ Nội vụ và Bộ trưởng Tư pháp. Và dĩ nhiên là ông Jason Clare cũng là dân biểu ở trong cái khu Blaxland, là Biron cũng là một trong cái bộ phận của Blaxland. Và như ông Jason cho biết thì vợ của ông là cô Louise Độ cũng đang trên đường tới đây, thì khi cô tới đây thì chúng tôi cũng sẽ mời cô tham dự vào cuộc phỏng vấn. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a very special program because as we all know, we are going to be voting this Saturday in the federal election. It is with great pleasure that we have an opportunity to have Jason Clare, a very close friend of the Vietnamese community, who is a member for Blaxland and Minister for Home Affairs and Minister for Justice. First time in the studio. My welcome to you, Jason, and thanks very much for making your time with us tonight.
Oh, thank you, Tan. It's fantastic to be here. This is you're right, the first time I've been at the 2VNR studios. It's a great studio, great radio station, and a great opportunity to talk about the election and what happens on Saturday, how to make sure that everybody that turns up to vote votes formally. That'll be the most important thing that happens, because we need to make sure that everyone's vote counts.
Yes, and I definitely will come to that question of informal votes. But before that, we've got how many days out? 3 days out to the election.
I think 3 sleeps to go.
3 sleeps to go. All the polls point to a big win for the coalition. How confident are you that Labour can make a comeback, similar to the comeback of Paul Keating, your predecessor, not your predecessor, but the member for Blaxland, previous member for Blaxland, who made a comeback in 1993. How confident are you that Labour can rewrite history?
Well, it's going to be tough. The Liberal Party are in front, Labor Party is behind, and if the polls are right, then Tony Abbott will become the Prime Minister on Saturday night. I think that would be bad for our local community, because our community does best when we invest in things like education. The Vietnamese community knows better than any other community in Australia that education is the key to the future. If we put our money in our children, then we will have success in the future. And at this election, there's a very big choice on education. The government has said that we'll invest an extra $10 billion right across Australia to make sure that our schools have the resources they need. The Liberal Party has said that they'll take about $8 billion of that away and only invest about $2.8 billion. So that means that our schools won't be as well off. Each school would lose about $1 million a year. That's an enormous amount, and that's what's at stake on Saturday. There's an old saying that Paul Keating used to say, that when you change the government, you change the country.
You change the country, yes.
And if the polls are right, then the country will change, and I don't think it will be for the better.
Not so much the seat in southwest of Sydney, not so much your seat, the seat of Blaxland, the seat of McMahon and Fowler, but looking at all the other marginal seats, particularly in Western Sydney, we're talking about Banks, the seat of Parramatta, Reid, Greenway and Lindsay. All these seats, you would traditionally call them the heartland of Labor. But all the recent polling seems to suggest that the voters are turning away from Labor. Why do you think that is the case?
Well, I guess, Tung, we have to wait and see what happens on Saturday. But Western Sydney is a unique place. We have a big population, and we have big challenges when it comes to cost of living and to traffic and congestion. I think some of the challenges that Western Sydney faces are more intense than the rest of the country. And let me give you an example. The average income of people who live in Western Sydney is lower than people who live on the North Shore or in the eastern suburbs. But the cost of housing, buying a house, and the cost of rent is not much cheaper. And so the amount of money that we've got in our pocket at the end of the day is a lot less. So the cost of buying the groceries becomes really important. We're also a place where there's a lot of people living very closely together, a lot of traffic on the M4 and the M5, and so all of those issues that are tougher here than they are in any other part of Australia mean that when people come to vote, it's always on their mind and they're very worried. The Labor Party here in Western Sydney is represented by some good men and some good women, people who grew up here in Western Sydney, like Chris Bowen and like Chris Hayes and like myself. And we think it's an enormous privilege to have the chance to represent our community in Canberra. And we'll be working very hard right until Saturday night to earn the respect of our community and the honour to represent them again.
Yep, I'll come back to the electioneering in a minute, but I've noticed that Louise has just arrived. Welcome, Louise, and it's great to have you on in the studio tonight.
Hi there, thank you for having me.
Well, Louise, I won't put you on the spot straight away by asking you some question in Vietnamese, but firstly, how hard is this to be a spouse of a politician, particularly during the election period? Particularly a minister, how busy it is, and how do you explain to people the sacrifice that politicians and their families make? But quite often people don't see it. They see the glamour. They see politicians on stage, but sometime behind the scene with family life, ordinary life pressure. If you could just give us a few tips, a few hits.
Yeah, of course. And interesting you use the word glamour, because I see the side that is very unglamorous. The side where Jason has to get up at 5 a.m. in the morning, isn't home until 11 p.m. in the evenings. He works really, really hard, and really hard for the community, because I see how passionate he is, how hardworking he is, and that's the person I met, and that's the person I admire, and that's the person I fell in love with. So people don't see that side, and you're right, it is hard. It's very hard to be someone watching from the side and trying to support the person that you care about. But the passion is what drives Jason, and that's what gets him through, and it's part of the job.
Yes, well, let's go back to Jason, and can I just go to this particular topic, which is the topic of asylum seekers. And Louise, I think, mentioned before that, or even you did mention that we Vietnamese Australians, the majority of us came to Australia as refugees.
Yes.
We spent a bit of our time in the refugee camps. I don't know in your case, Louise, whether you did spend some time in the camp at all, but definitely your parents would have been. Now, leaving aside the substantive policies to deal with this extremely difficult issue, are you concerned that the tone of the debate seems to be increasingly that both sides of politics are trying to act as if we have to get tough on refugees, we have to make it really, really difficult for them, we have to be mean in some sense to make it really, really difficult for them to think about coming to Australia? And are you concerned that the way it's going, it may invoke the dark spots in our hearts? It may encourage people to come out with their worst instincts and prejudices.
Well, I do worry about all of those things. It's very personal for me and for Louise and our family, because you're right, Louise's mum and dad fled Saigon on boats in 1978 after Saigon had fallen. And when I was a little boy in Cabramatta, I went to Cabramatta Public School. All the boys and girls in my class at primary school and at high school were refugees, about your age, Tom. And I heard their stories. I knew what had happened to them. There are people in this debate who want to play politics and play on people's fears, and that's the wrong thing to do, and I have tried to ensure that I never do that. From my point of view, it's about trying to make sure that we get the policies right so people don't die coming to the best country in the world. The people listening to the program tonight who fled on boats from Vietnam know how many people drown leaving Vietnam. The solution came when the United Nations worked with Malaysia and Thailand, Philippines and other countries to set up camps, and then good countries like Australia and the United States put up their hand and said, we will take you and you can come to Australia. And that's the story of Louise's family, a big family. And that's what we need to do here. We need to repeat what we did after the tragedy of the fall of Saigon, and get the countries of our region to work together so that people that are fleeing persecution can get to Australia safely, not paying a people smuggler $10,000 and then maybe getting here, maybe not. I've got the job of telling the Australian people when people drowned. I had to tell the Australian people that a little boy drowned, 2.5 months old. And we shouldn't have to do that. You shouldn't have to risk your life to come to Australia. There's got to be a better way, and that's the approach that I've taken and Tony Burke has taken. Other people play politics with this issue and exploit it for political ends, and that does bring out the darker spirits of our community. I've seen that myself, people sending very nasty emails to me, and make sure that we develop policy that's designed to help refugees and not encourage people to risk their life. We're a good country. We take more refugees and settle more refugees per capita than any other country in the world.
Yeah.
And that's per capita. In real numbers, I think we're second or third after America. So we're a good people, and Australia is better because of the refugees that have made Australia their home. I was speaking to a man at Bankstown railway station this morning who told me about a refugee that came to Australia on a boat around about 13 years ago, and now he's a doctor at Westmead Hospital. And he's just one example. All the boys and all the girls that were in that classroom at Cabramatta Public School, they're now doctors and lawyers and pharmacists and engineers. They're making Australia...
And radio announcers, of course.
Exactly right. But the Australia that I vaguely remember as a 5-year-old boy is not as great a country as it is now, because we've got people that have made Australia their home from all around the world. South America, Europe, the Middle East, Asia, and I've got a particular bias to Vietnam.
And Louise, being married to an Australian politician, what sort of Vietnamese influence do you bring? Like, I mean, do you get him to use chopsticks?
Food is probably the key thing that I've introduced more and more into Jason's world and life.
Right.
When we'd met, he'd probably had pho, and I'm not sure what else you tried, but I introduced him to a beautiful restaurant in Canley Vale, which we go to and visit really often now. It's called Hai Ông.
Oh, okay.
And Gan Chua Cá, Tôm Kho Tàu, Tôm Kho Tàu, Bò Tái Chanh. All of those dishes are now staple in our weekly visits to the Vietnamese restaurants.
Right.
So if anything, food I would have contributed, and family. I've got, as Jason mentioned, my dad has 11 brothers and sisters. I come from a very big, I've got many aunties and uncles all over the world actually, and Jason's become one of the trans. And,
Yeah, I grew up in a really small family, one brother.
Oh.
And now that Louise and I married, I have this big extended family. Louise's dad has 11 brothers and sisters, lots in Melbourne, and some in Vietnam,
and the US,
and the US at Orange County in LA as well. And so I've got to meet all of the extended family, and including Dr. Dong Bak Dong, who is a very famous doctor in Victoria, who's got a medical centre in Springvale. And I've also got 2 new grandmothers as well, Banoi and Banai. So and listening to them and learning from them, and Banoi, she's helping out on elections with the election campaign as well, because she speaks Cantonese and Vietnamese and helping out with the election. But meeting them and talking to them, I've learned a lot more about the needs of the Vietnamese elderly community too, which I've transferred to help with the debates we're having about aged care centres.
Yes, that's in fact, I'm glad that you brought it up, because there is always a sense of family in the Vietnamese life, and increasingly we are having quite a lot of people. It's estimated we're going to have, I think, several thousands, at least 5,000 to 10,000 Vietnamese in New South Wales over the age of 65 in the next few years.
Yes.
And in terms of government assistance to aged care services, what can you tell us? What have Labor done, or what can you do to assist in terms of aged care, home care, with particular emphasis on Vietnamese Australians?
Yeah, we're all getting older, the whole community is getting older, and as part of that we're going to need more aged care centres. One of the big jobs that's going to be created for the boys and girls who are at school at the moment is working in aged care as nurses and as doctors and assistants. It's important that aged care meets the needs of individuals. Not everybody wants to have sandwiches for lunch. Not everybody wants a meat pie for dinner. When I first got involved in the campaign, I heard the story of a Vietnamese grandmother who was taken to a regular aged care centre, and she was given a sandwich for dinner, and her daughter said that her mum had never had a sandwich in her life. Can she have some Vietnamese food? That you've got people, including doctors and nurses who speak Vietnamese, you've got the food that you love, and the people around you that make you feel comfortable. Often people who came to Australia after Saigon fell at the age of maybe 40 and had to pick up English for the first time. By the time you get into your 70s, you start to lose English again. And all the more reason why you need an aged care centre which is going to properly look after your needs. Lots of Vietnamese families look after their elderly at home, and that's a great thing. It's better if you can be at home because it's the best place in the world. But when people get very old, they get dementia and they get very frail and have extra special needs, and that's when you need an aged care centre. Which is why with Chris Bowen and Chris Hayes we've worked together to help get government support for the first Vietnamese aged care centre, which will be at Smithfield.
Yes.
And that includes a lot of government money to provide a no interest loan to get that project off the ground. It's the first of what will have to be many.
Yeah.
The Chinese community have been doing this for a number of years, lots of Chinese aged care centres. We need to make sure that this is not the one and only. This is the first of many Vietnamese aged care centres in Sydney and in Melbourne and all parts of Australia.
Yeah.
You mentioned one more thing, which is home care, which is really important. This is something I've been working with the VCA on, because for a lot of people who don't need to be in a aged care facility, they do need a little bit of help with cooking, cleaning, washing, just all the, just a little helping hand so that they can stay at home. Home care is what does that. And I know the VCA that do great work for our community in lots of different areas, whether it's settlement services or whether it's anti-gambling services or whether it's the campaign for democracy in Vietnam. The VCA is also interested in whether they can become a provider of home care services. I think that's a terrific idea. And if I'm re-elected on the weekend, that's one of the projects I want to take up to see if we can get the VCA to begin providing that service for our community as well.
Yes, look, I'm sure that you won't have too much problem in the city of Blaxland. Having said that, we can't take anything for granted. And now, Louise, can I come back to you? Irrespective of what the election outcome on the weekend is, I think it's fair to say that many people are looking at your husband, Jason Clare, as a future leader, a potential Prime Minister. Has it ever dawned on you that you one day you'll wake up as a wife of a Prime Minister of Australia, a child of a refugee family from Vietnam?
Well, I have heard people say this, but to be honest, Jason and I are an ordinary couple. We live in the community, we spend time with family and friends, and we take every day one day at a time. And whatever comes, Jason's an amazing person. He should be the local member, but Jason and I are ordinary people who live in the region of Bankstown, and that thought is a bit scary. So there's a lot of pressure on him, I suppose.
Well, it will be a bonus if he does one day become. The reason we would like to see that is, I think the Vietnamese community sometimes almost claim him as a son of the community.
Well,
so I think we're looking forward to having him to occupy a very high office. Jason, can I come back to you on a matter dear to the hearts of many Vietnamese Australians? It is a question of human rights in Vietnam. I know that you've been a very supportive member of the Parliament when it comes to that issue, but it seems that Australia has been having this annual human rights dialogue with Vietnam for a long, long time.
Yeah, 10 years.
10 years now. And over the last 10 years, we're not sure whether there has been any specific progress. We have not been given any specific briefings as to what happened in those talks. And it seems that as recently in the last few months, the question of human rights in Vietnam is getting worse. More and more people, bloggers, are being arrested and imprisoned and given very long jail sentences. So is there anything that you think the Labour Party and you can do to have more specific measures to help us in the cause of human rights in Vietnam?
Well, let me give you my personal view rather than political view, because you and I have been talking about this for 5-6 years, and I think we both agree that the dialogue between Australia and Vietnam is important because it gives the Foreign Minister of Australia, our leading spokesperson to the world, the opportunity to put on the table all of those human rights abuses that worry us so much in Vietnam. The concern the community has, and I think it's a valid one, is that we don't necessarily know what the outcomes are of those discussions. And I get that, I agree with you. One of the recommendations that came out of a parliamentary committee that looked at this last year was that we need more detail in the annual report that the Department of Foreign Affairs puts out every year about all of these human rights dialogues that occurred, not just with Vietnam but other countries as well, because the abuses of human rights doesn't just occur in Vietnam, happens in many countries around the world. We're lucky that we're about to have an election where regardless of whoever wins, there'll be a peaceful handover of power if it moves from one party to another. It doesn't happen like that in Vietnam.
No.
It doesn't happen like that in many parts of the world. You only have to turn the TV on to know that. My personal view is that I think the committee's right. We do need to make sure that we know what happens in the meeting, what the issues are that are raised, what the outcomes are of those discussions, because then as a community we're better informed about what happened and what we need to do next as part of our continuing peaceful campaign. And this is the thing that I love so much about the Vietnamese community. We campaign together for democracy and freedom and an improvement in human rights in Vietnam, but we do that with prayer and with candles, not with guns and cannons. That's the way to do it. That's what Martin Luther King taught us, and it's 50 years now since his I Have a Dream speech. That's what Robert Kennedy and others taught us as well. That's what Gandhi taught us. And that's what the Vietnamese community is doing here in Australia.
Yes. One other important question that I think you raised at the very beginning, that is the percentage of informal votes in the city of Blaxland. I looked at some information. It appears that Blaxland recorded the highest percentage of informal votes in the 2010 election, nearly 15%. And we're talking about, that's a lot of votes. I think close to 100,000 voters in the city of Blaxland.
That's right. So about 14,000 people filled out the ballot paper and it was thrown in the bin.
Correct. So, one of the things is that it's very hard for some members of our community to understand that apparently there will be two ballot papers, the green ballot paper to vote members of representatives, and they have to actually number
every single box.
Every single box. Whereas traditionally, all people thought what they had to do was just to give someone a tick, or they look at you, they like you, bang. Tick. So why is it so difficult? Why does the system make it so complex for people to vote in federal elections?
It's a good question. The law of Australia in elections is that you have to give a preference vote to every single candidate. You have to decide who's your number one, who is number two, who is number three, who is number four, who is number five, who's number six, etc.
And how many candidates are in the city of Blaxland? Seven.
Yeah.
Right. So they have to put number one to number seven. So they look at the ballot paper, they have to write one to the person that they like the most.
Then number two for the next.
Number two the next, and all from 1 to 7.
That's right. So that's why the piece of paper that you get at the school gate is so important, because if you like the candidate, if you want to support me,
Yes.
then you just copy the numbers in the order
Right.
that it appears on the piece of paper that my
Right.
volunteers give you.
Right.
It's called a how to vote. This is how to vote for Jason. A lot of people say, I love you, Jason, you're great. I always put a number 1 next to you and then put it in the box. And I said, well, if you do that, you didn't vote for me, because the law is really tough. The law says you've got to put a 1 next to your favourite candidate, and if that's me, terrific. And then 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7.
So
Yeah.
all 7 boxes have to be filled, and they can't repeat any numbers. So it has to be from 1 to 7.
That's right. If you make a mistake and say go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8,
Yes.
that won't be counted either.
Right.
So one of the important things to do is take your time, read the information, and there'll be information in Vietnamese at the polling booth as well.
Yes.
And if you make a mistake, then somebody will be able to give you a new piece of paper to fill out.
Yes, great. Okay, Louise, I'll leave the last question to you, and perhaps this question I'd like you to answer in Vietnamese.
He'll probably...
So, the last 3 years has been at
I could have
times...
done the last question in Vietnamese. I was going to say that when you fill out the ballot paper, you've got to make sure that you fill it out with Muk Hai Bao Bo Nam Sao Bay.
Good job. Good try. Now, the last 3 years sometimes hasn't been pretty for Labour. There's, changes of leadership, a lot of things happening. As a wife of Jason Clare, perhaps if you could just say this in Vietnamese to our listeners, tại sao người ta nên bầu cho Jason vào cái ngày thứ Bảy này? Why should people, particularly the listeners, Vietnamese Australians, why should they vote for Jason Clare this Saturday? And if you could, you please say it in Vietnamese.
Kính chào quý vị. Làm ơn thứ Bảy bầu cho Jason Clare, tại vì Jason người tốt. Jason làm việc rất là tốt cho cộng đồng Việt Nam. Và Jason giống như người Việt Nam luôn.
Và nếu như mà họ muốn bầu cho Jason Clare thì phải bảo đảm, phải chắc chắn là bỏ từ số 1 cho Jason rồi tới số 2, số 3, số 4, số 5, số 7.
Dạ, đúng.
Tại có 7 người đứng ra tranh cử.
Dạ, có đơn màu xanh lá cây.
Dạ.
Phải ghi số 1. Nếu mà muốn bầu cử cho Jason thì một cái tên Jason. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 tới 7.
Rồi, okay. Cảm ơn Louise rất là nhiều. Look, I think she probably said it a lot better than you if you were to answer that question. Well, look, Jason, well, thanks so much for coming up here. It was a pleasure to welcome both of you, and I hope that everything will go well for you on Saturday.
Thank you very much.
And hopefully, whatever we lose or draw, we'll have an opportunity to welcome you again in the studio in the future.
I hope
Well,
so.
thanks very much for
Thank
coming.
you.
Thank you very much.
Okay,
Cảm ơn.
thank you.
Cảm ơn.
Okay, thank you. Kính thưa quý khán thính giả, quý vị vừa theo dõi cuộc phỏng vấn của chúng tôi với ông Jason Clare, Bộ trưởng Bộ Nội vụ, Bộ trưởng Tư pháp, và cô Louise Đỗ là vợ của ông Jason Clare. Chúng tôi hỏi ông Jason Clare một số vấn đề thì chúng tôi cũng xin được tóm tắt là thứ nhất đó là về cái vấn đề bầu cử, cái cuộc tranh cử vào cái ngày thứ Bảy này đó, là nó là một cái cuộc bầu cử rất là gay go. Thì ông Jason vận động kêu gọi mọi người bầu cho ông Jason Clare cũng giống như bầu cho Đảng Lao động. Một trong những vấn đề quan trọng là cái lá phiếu bầu đó. Trong cái ghế Blaxland thì sẽ có 7 ứng cử viên, thì quý vị phải điền vào từ số 1 cho tới số 7. Thí dụ như quý vị muốn bầu cho ông Jason Clare thì điền số 1 kế bên tên ổng. Rồi sau đó số 2, số 3, số 4, số 5, số 7 không có được để trống cái ô nào, và cũng không được lặp lại cái số. Thì dĩ nhiên quý vị muốn bầu cho một cái người ứng cử viên khác thì cũng có quyền và cũng làm giống như vậy. Nếu như không thì cái lá phiếu bầu của quý vị sẽ trở thành bất hợp lệ. Thứ ba là ông Jason Clare cho biết là trong thời gian vừa qua ông đã làm việc với cộng đồng người Việt về vấn đề giúp đỡ chăm sóc những người cao niên, và chính quyền lao động cũng đã có hỗ trợ cho một nhóm trong cộng đồng đó là hội AVEX để mà thành lập viện dưỡng lão. Và như mọi người đều biết thì ông Jason Clare thường xuyên tham dự vào những cái sinh hoạt cộng đồng, đặc biệt là những cái sinh hoạt tranh đấu cho nhân quyền, và ông sẽ tiếp tục hỗ trợ cho cộng đồng trong cái khía cạnh đó. Thì đó là một vài cái điểm tóm tắt chính của chúng tôi trong cái cuộc phỏng vấn ngày hôm nay. Một lần nữa xin cảm ơn quý vị đã theo dõi và lắng nghe.